Lou, you're muted.
Sorry. Okay, let me start again. So I just wanted to say that I think, yeah, your film does this excellent work in showing this intersection of petrocolonial imperialism, militarism, and environmental destruction, in this particular case of Curaçao and the Netherlands. And I mean, I say historically, but of course, the film really insinuates to how these interwoven form of oppressions under the guise of modernization and the way and their transformation and adaptations really resonate with what, when I first watched the film, has been happening here in the Netherlands, not only in the Netherlands, but like this where I and most of us are located. So like the events that have been happening in the past 1.5 years, 2 years. So I'm referring to, of course, last year's Black Lives Matter protests, but also, for example, the actions of like fossil-free culture. Then, of course, this year's like win of by Eind's seat in the parliament, and yeah, the currently, I think, most present and ongoing like Free Palestine protests. So I think maybe in our discussions we will kind of like come back to this like situation or situating like the problematics like that you touch upon with your research in our conversation. But maybe first, each of you, of the speakers, could like just briefly introduce themselves. And as Yolanda suggested, like maybe a bit about like either what you're researching right now or how like this film kind of resonated with you. Do you want to go first, Yolanda?
Yes, I could go first. My name is Yolanda Johnson, and I teach a course at NICA about political philosophy and the decolonial humanities. And I think that's why you asked me to respond to the film. Yeah, I also was really impressed by the film and by everything you bring together, and also in a way feeling like really ashamed in the sense of having been teaching about decolonial matters for a long time already, and then realizing how little I know of the Dutch. I studied France much more, but there's so much to know about the Dutch situation that's like should be like general knowledge, and it's just not the case. So that's yeah, I was really impressed. A few things that I thought might yeah, that resonated with me in the research that I'm doing was one was reminded me very much of an article by Gurmandir Bamra, which I found very good. We read it in our class, also that Mika was there too. And it was about colonial global economy, and she presses very much on the idea that also left-wing analysis of capitalism have always suggested or tend to suggest that capitalism is something developing out of itself, and then it takes colonialism with it as like it's an add-on. It's merely the companion of condition of the emergence of capitalism. And so this displaces colonialism from the center of the analysis. And what she argues for very much is like the constitutive nature of the appropriation and commodification of land and labor to the development of capitalism. And this is something that has been, yeah, I think been discussed quite extensively already for the 19th century and like for the era of like official colonialism. But also your film shows really very well, I think, how this went on after the Second World War, and how the entanglement of capitalism and these colonial legacies, how extremely strong they are. And yeah, I thought it was really important, and also something that needs to be so much more discussed also in public cultures. Yeah, so that was one aspect that struck me really as important. And then also Bamra is talking about the epistemic dimension and also the role of academic knowledge. And then at a certain point she says, the failure of most theorists of capitalism to acknowledge the ways in which capitalist development globally was fundamentally dependent upon colonial exploitation and appropriation appears to be a consequence of an almost deliberately cultivated ignorance. And this is also like, it's a cultivated ignorance that where the universities play a role in, instead of bringing this knowledge to the fore. And it's like, I think more and more people of like working now in universities are getting aware of that this is the case, but it's still also in the beginning, of course, but this is really important, I think. So and then one other thing that struck me very much in your film was that Bamra is then going to, she says, in the context of the welfare state being seen to be a national project for the amelioration of capitalism, it is rarely asked in what is distributed, where was the surplus generated that is redistributed. And that's also, I think, important that in your film, it shows so much, like also how naive the Dutch public culture that I was raised in myself also is, about like the whole imagination about colonies being costly, and then people not knowing about all these, like what you show about this whole history of Shell and the militarization and everything that was appropriated instead. So that's yeah, that was really important too, I thought. Maybe something else that I would like to address was one other article that we read from Selwa Lust Bulbina, and maybe you also read other things, like in the culture-oriented humanities from Ariella Azoulay, Unlearning Imperialism. There was just a masterclass with her, and both Azoulay and also Bulbina, who works in the French context, well, it's not that they criticize, but Bulbina uses the term of low-cost decolonization, and by that she means decolonization of objects and thinking of the decolonization of objects. And what she says, what is really a much more challenging task is decolonization of social and political structures. And I think that is also something that your film really speaks to, like how much this will take, and also how important it is, and how just it would be. And so that's maybe I would like to end. Oh yeah, and one thing, you, Lou, in your beginning, you said something about the Shell sorry, the Shell, how do you say it? The Shell case that we have had in the Netherlands, of course, is just very prominent at the moment. What struck me from your film was that, like, when we're talking about the Shell case in the Netherlands, it's very much about the ecological dimension. And I think it would be really important that we get the colonial dimension of these issues also to the fore. So not just the ecological. And of course, people go to people know now much more about Nigeria actually than about Curaçao, interestingly, I think. But this would also be really important to bring up these historical layers of the role that Shell played in Dutch culture, but like with oil, but also in these these capitalist colonial structures, that we bring that this gets more into a debate as well, or part of the debate, and not just in the cultural sphere, but like I always think we should have much more of efforts to bring this into a public and much more bigger public debate. Yeah, okay, that was my contribution, but thanks a lot for your impressive movie.
Thank you.
Does someone want to respond, or?
I do.
Yeah, then maybe just go forward, and then we can continue with like my questions.
Yolanda and Lou, first I wanted to thank you for your rich intellectual contribution for a film I made. I'm very glad for your interpretations, because it's quite on target on what I wanted to get across. We maybe talk differently because we come from different milieus and different areas of knowledge. But for me, there is not a clear distinction, just to try to catch up with some meta themes that you approached. For me, there's not a big distinction between capital and colonial. I see, that's why I have a problem with the term post-coloniality, in the sense like Lyotard said in the Newman, when he's talking about modernism, and that he doesn't see a distinction between modernism and postmodernism. I also don't see a distinction between colonial and post-colonial. Although, and I don't want to, by saying this, I don't want to take the value of freedom fights that took place mainly in the 60s, but also before. And the freedom of coloniality. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that we came from a moment from having colonies to not having colonies, but we didn't change the system. So we kept operating in the same way. And what I'm trying to evolve, and also what you tried to say, Yolanda, I'm trying to say with much easier words than probably you will, but so the system of exploitation of bodies and exploitation of natural resources is something that we see today as well. My phone, the laptop that I'm talking from, it's all resources and extraction of labor, and that's how profit is made. So actually the system didn't really change, maybe in appearance, but in modus operandi, we're functioning at the same level, actually. And a deep reflection about that would be helpful.
Can I ask you still two questions?
Of course.
I was wondering, I forgot to do that. I was planning to start with that. Could you say something more about the title of the film, Geographies of Freedom? Because I was wondering, like, how the freedom has also a very, ironical dimension also, or the opposite. Yeah, well, so that was the question. And also, could you tell us, there was this fragment about the robbery of from the colonized peoples, and then there was where the bombs were made that could also fall on the houses of, like, can you say what that was? It was one of the only ones I couldn't
place.
Yeah.
Yeah, that specific segment that you're talking about, it's a NSB propaganda film. So it's a Dutch Nazi film. And they're condemning the attacks of the Americans on Europe. So that's why. But I wanted to pick up that piece because they make, although it's Nazi and it's fascist, they do make the bridge between Curacao being a very important geopolitical point for the Allies. From Curacao came all the oil that fueled the planes of the Americans. And from Suriname came all the aluminium, which allowed them to build the planes. So the colonial setting of the Netherlands was incredibly important, especially for the royal house, something that they forget now. But without the colonial, especially in South America and in the Caribbean, I don't think that the royal house had survived. Mm. So that's one thing. So that's that segment. To go back to your question about the name, when we started this project years ago, me and Egbert were the initial starting point was a court case from 1736 from an enslaved person that escaped Curaçao and came to the Netherlands. And he was fighting here for his freedom because he knew that officially in the Netherlands there was no slavery. There was, but anyway, let's just forget the details. In legal terms, there wasn't. So he tried to 2 times in a court case, 3 times in a court case to defend himself. And he was declared free 2 times in Amsterdam. Only his owner in Curaçao made an appeal to the Hoge Raad, the High Court. And there the judge found that Klaas, that was his name, at least that's the name that appears on the scriptures, was both the thief and the thing stolen. And that's why he had to be returned to Curaçao. It's interesting referring, right? So that was the starting point, but we were actually, the name is Geographies of Freedom because we wanted to contradict this idea that still today lives a lot in the Netherlands as being the country of freedom. You know, you can have gay rights here, you can smoke weed, we are all happy, we're all free. But there's a geography difference between several ways of freedom, as this court case that I just explained shows. So when he came from Curaçao, at one moment the law didn't apply to him anymore, so they had to think of something to ship him back. But you still have, like, when was it? 3 years ago, I believe, there was this journalist together with a priest that came to announce that they wanted to put in the World Heritage Dutch freedom. I can send you this article, it's really interesting. So they're saying that the Netherlands are so a beacon of freedom that their freedom should be considered a world heritage. Which, of course, if we look at the situation in the Netherlands, I don't even, you referred, Lou, the Black Lives Matter movement, but I would go even further than that. I mean, this discussion about civil rights has been going on like for ages. And we tend to think a lot in the last 2 years, but there's a long history of people trying to show that freedom in Dutch colonial rule is not that plain. And one of the big examples, and then I shut up, is of course the recently added to the canon of literature in the Netherlands, Anton de Kom, and his We Slaves of Suriname. I advise everyone to read that, because what he describes there is really appalling, to say the least.
Yeah, no, thank you, Yolanda, for like already bringing this up. I think this was definitely one of the first questions, also because, of course, your partner, Edgar Martina, also writes, I think he has a blog also for everyone who's interested, and he writes very well and elaborate on like, not like on this like inherent contradiction within the Dutch notion of freedom, right? Which also, of course, translates to other like Western kind of Enlightenment ideas of freedom as an abstract concept rather than a spatially conditioned construct, which you in your research formulate as freedom when and where, right? And I'm gonna share just like a quote that I found really striking from his writing, which in the chat, one second. where he brings that also to the position of blackness as like, and basically whiteness being needing like blackness as being defined, or like here as the sin to be overcome, and whiteness as the proof of its having been overcome. Whiteness is therefore not, or thus not simply a marker of freedom and beauty, as if this is not outrageous enough on its own. But in Wolenwik's work, Wolenwik was a Dutch writer who like kind of wrote this kind of foundational work about like what the meaning of Dutch freedom and its like essence, a central role for Dutch identity, is also the color of salvation. What follows from this is that white subjects can be ontologically free only because black subjects embody an absolute, inescapable captivity. Ontological captivity is the ghost that haunts all situational freedom and unfreedom. And I mean, I think this may be more like speaking on an ontological level. I think your Edgar also points out at one point that this realization is extremely important if we speak about decolonization and about like changing a narrative, because it's not only about like rewriting history, but it's really about like the impossibility kind of that comes with like an ontological status of non-being kind of. And maybe we can like kind of lead this to a discussion also more of like the like narrative or maybe lack of narrative within your movie, and like this very strong element of working from within the archive in your research. So what does it mean to work in and through the archive? Maybe you can tell us a bit about like what archive you actually visited and like how you chose the material that you worked with. Especially because, of course, this is material that by the fact of its like mere presence and being selected already perpetuates a kind of white colonial gaze and like erases or denies other forms of sensibility and representation. And then also, what challenges did you face when, in your own words, I do think these are your own words, please correct me if I'm wrong, mediating archival threats of colonial history from the position of being an entity who embodies such political inheritance? So
that's not me, but that's okay.
Okay, sorry.
No, don't mind.
Let's say it was written in your name.
It's nice words. So it's okay, I don't mind. There was, I did this archival footage research in Beeld en Geluid Archive. That's the television archive of the Netherlands, and actually also film from the 30s and 40s, because there's a mixed media thing. I don't know, anyway. And I did it 2 times. I did once in 2013, and I did the second time now in 2019. And there's a big difference between the two. So in the first one, the archive was not fully digitalized, was not fully online. They only had it on their intraweb. And the second one was online. The first one I found really difficult to do research because you could only look for things by tags. And the people who tagged that didn't do a very good job. So whenever you, right now as well, if you go to the open source of the Beeld en Geluid archive, they have one part of their collection that's open for everyone. If you go there and you type racism, you'll find one video. And that video is of a Jewish woman. That's the only thing you'll find. And a similar experience I had when it was on their intraweb. When it came online, there was a big difference, because what happened is that the software recognized every single word on the video as a tag. So it was much more easier for me to do the research. That being said, so I could find relatively more easily things about Curaçao, but I still had to go on a meta level, and my search was mainly Curaçao as a word, and then everything I picked up. I am forgetting something. Anyway, I forgot a part of your question.
Well, one part of my question, I think, is about like your, like you juxtaposing kind of extremely over narrated, right? Like newsreels, like almost with interviews with like of representatives of the worker unions, etc. So there's already like a kind of, it makes the like newsreels almost appear periodic, like ridiculous. But then again, you also frame it within these, like, I guess your field research of having these like landscape shots, which are kind of more devoid of human narration. But of course, your editing process is also a form of narration. But I wonder, like, whether, you know, this like, there is like whether you refrained from having, for example, your own like voiceover or something for a particular reason, or like what was your process there? And like,
okay, I'll take this because it's hot. Now, anyone that works in the audiovisual sector knows that editing is manipulating, no matter what. Every single news that you see on television is edited and therefore manipulated. There's not one single second of that that's not manipulated. That being said, so I am aware that I'm also putting my voice in the work when I'm editing. And now to refer to the material itself, you can roughly divide it in three segments. You have the first segment from the 30s, 20s, 30s up until the 60s, where you have actually propaganda. I'm sorry to say it, but the newsreel that were in that time was purely propaganda. It's not informative at all. It's just putting this idea of the Netherlands bringing civilization to the world, bringing modernization, as you see in my film, bringing this welfare state all to underdeveloped areas. And the reality was, it was an extraction of resources. That's what it was. No. And then you have a small critical period between the 60s, the late 60s and the 70s, where you see television in the Netherlands questioning more sharply what happens in that period. But that's a very brief period, like 15 years maybe. And then there's a shift again in the 80s, where the discourse, we kind of, I'm afraid to say this almost reminds me of the period of the 30s, 40s, 50s. Even now, if I watch at the news, I see almost no criticism about the colonial project or about, even Shell is sometimes even defended. And if we go to Shell to specifically talk about one example, and I'm not a Shell warrior, I'm not trying to fight Shell alone, but if you look at Shell, there's recently an article at the Financieel Dagblad, which is a newspaper that I don't read very often, but I read it because they made a research about the CO2 emission of Shell. And if you look at that, Shell in the Netherlands emits 7 million tons of CO2. It's the third largest geographical area where they emit CO2. There's 2 more areas where they emit more CO2. That's in the whole United States. And it's in the whole Middle East. And in the Netherlands, we are not talking about this. We have incredibly polluted air. I know a friend of mine who has lungs problems, and he thought that it would do good for him to go to the beach. His lung doctor told him that he better could stay home because being in the open air is a danger for his life. So there's a lot of things going on that we are not really discussing yet, and mainly because it's profit. Shell brings money into the Dutch government, and so let's keep things as they are. It's basically it. I don't know if I answered your question or I just was making a political statement, but
No. I think that's all of this is necessary within here. But yeah, I mean, maybe we can also go and like talk more about like I want to also include Mikayla maybe because you worked yourself in Curaçao as a teacher, you're a poet, and you're, I think, have a lot of knowledge from what is actually going on the ground. I do also want to take the opportunity to like ask you maybe about your impression of the appearance of Papiamento in the film. I noticed that Miguel, you used Papiamento to like have the titles, or these like, yeah, the titles to like kind of intersect your film. And I was wondering, of course, also in the film, we see how language is like either instrumentalized as like a tool for indoctrination or, but also maybe like a path of flight from containment. But yeah, maybe Mikayla, you can shortly like introduce yourself and then comment if you like.
Yeah, so my name is Mikayla Vieira Ribeiro, and currently I'm doing my research master's in literature in Amsterdam, which is to say I'm part of the educational migration that is presented in the film. That's because I'm from Curaçao. I was born and raised there. And actually, my family came to Curaçao for Shell 3 generations ago. And I live on the asphalt there, but upwind. So it's quite interesting to see it in a film, like presented like this, as something that, yeah, I don't know, I've seen every day of my life, pretty much. As for takeaways from the film, or some things that I have been thinking about, was especially this thing of geographies of freedom and where freedom is located. And obviously, it's not located in the Netherlands, which is what we're always taught to believe. Also, obviously, freedom's not located in the industrialization of Curaçao. So like industrialization through Isla or through Shell. But that's also where, to answer your question about the Papiamento, I also really like the opening and the closing of the film. In that it opens with a folk song, Di Que Manera, right? Which is a folk song. You can also give me more history, Miguel, but it's a folk song that was sung during and after slavery, the abolishment of slavery. And it's also the title of Professor Rosemary Allen's book about Afro-Curaçaoans 50 years after slavery. And it talks a lot about like the resistance and the forms of survival of these ancestors, right, of the territory. And so when I was thinking of like, so where's the location of freedom? If it's not in the Netherlands, and if it's not in industry that has clearly brought so many problems along with the false promises, I think as the film, I think suggests, but also as what I think a lot of people are finding back home right now, is looking back to more ancestral ways of being, ancestral knowledge, right? But adapting it to what we need right now. So for example, like going back to learning what kinds of plants grow, what kind of farming can we do to be self-sustainable, what were like ancestral practices of water management, having Papiamento in the schools. Like you said, I was a teacher in public schools where now Papiamento is being taught. When I was in school, that was not the case. We had Dutch when I was back in elementary school. So yeah, I don't know. I was thinking a lot about the location of freedom. And I really, really, really love how Miguel and everyone who was involved in the film was able to have all the different shons, which for those of you, shon means master in Papiamento. So I thought it was really interesting how like migration, pollution, industrialization, like all of these are the sort of masters of oppression that still control the society, like today as well as historically. And how maybe the way out of that you see in the beginning and end is looking to like more local, ancestral like knowledge practices and like, yeah. So those were a bit of my takeaways.
Thank you. Those, yeah, I want to give you more stage. No, but it really invokes, I think, what also a lot of, I think, like in academia or like more cultural protectionists, a lot of people are thinking through in terms of that decolonization is not only about changing economy, political and social structures, but also about changing the way we sense and perceive. So, for example, Rolando Vázquez and Walter Mignolo, they speak about decolonial aesthesis that starts from the consciousness that like the modern colonial kind of project as an axis has implied not only control of economy and political knowledge, but also the control of the senses and perception. And I think I was curious about how that like kind of in your film maybe, yeah, appears more or less because you're working a lot with the archive. But I think there were these two scenes, one with the girl reading the story from the book, and the other one with the so like where you had these like ellipses that I think Miguel, did you create the ellipses for like the racial slur?
Yes, I took the racial slur out. Yeah, I muted it. Yeah.
And then the other scene like was with the like leader of the workers union, and this kind of like moment where the camera is like tilting away from them, actually kind of on the children, on the bare feet of the children, you know, and like how also the interviewer is kind of like completely ignorant to the pain of this person, like not being able to speak because of the pain, and like but still insisting on asking him, did you regret it? Like still insisting on trying to find a fault kind of within their actions, like this like complete like oblivion. Yeah, this like for me was really like the moments where I felt more disturbed and maybe like felt a crack within like a more smooth flow that could maybe allude to this kind of like change in perception, but
I must say, Lou, I had difficulties in accepting really using that small fragment of that child, but I found it so important to show that education is often used as a form of oppression instead of liberation. And that I think it's important to make clear, to have a reality check sometimes, like, are we using education in the right way, as we should? Because as Mikayla Ribeiro explained, it is until recently that people were allowed to have education in their own language. So for many kids, they came across the Dutch language for the first time in school, and they were completely flabbergasted about having to speak in another language. Another thing that I'm very happy that Mikayla contributed to was indeed that reference to papiamento. I chose to use, I don't speak papiamento fluently, but because I speak Portuguese, there's some parallels that I can understand quite some parts of it. And there's a detail that often escapes the most distracted eye, is that the only parts I didn't translate were the papiamento parts. Only in the titles I didn't translate it. I was thinking of not translating anything on papiamento, but because the audience, most of it is Western European, I wanted to have the message across anyway. But I try to allude indeed, like Mikayla said, about being this Sean, the master, and that we have several Seans, let's call it like that.
I think this could lead us in terms of education well into like a discussion of, I mean, we have you, Mikayla, you're in the university we have two people teaching at the university, and I think we should definitely discuss maybe the issues with decolonizing the university, but not end with decolonization becoming a metaphor. And of course, the current kind of stark issue of institutions not being willing to stand in solidarity with Palestine, for example, and what that means. Maybe before that, I want to just give Floris the chance to maybe introduce yourself. You are researching on the archiving of political films, and maybe you had a comment or something that stood out to you.
Yeah, well, I'm researching mainly the archiving of political films from the 60s and 70s that show critical view on all kinds of developments that had happened at that time. I think it's very interesting to see this kind of material that is more from mainstream media that usually is there in archives like snippets. And what Miguel has done is to create a context, a coherent framework to make sense of these little pieces. So when whomever would access the material, you don't know how to see it in what kind of perspective. So I think it's really important to create this perspective. And I think there is a clear narrative, which is, as Miguel has explained, it's a historical narrative of different periods, but it's also about the emergence of the industry and the reasons why the industry emerged there, what happened then when automation took place, and so on, and how that also relates to the Netherlands. What I really appreciate is this kind of coherent perspective, this systemic approach. So piecing together, putting together all these little small bits of media production, I think that is, well, it's a lot of work, first of all, but it's also, of editing, but it's also a lot of work of finding the material. And I really find it interesting what Miguel explained about the search keys and what he just said, if you type in racism, you get one hit. But what I find interesting is that we really live in a kind of language-dominated world in that sense, in an academic sense, or searching these kind of collections, that you need to use words to find the material. But what I find really striking is what you mentioned, Lou, the moment when the union leaders are answering the interviewer, where there is, let's say, non-verbal expression, and where you can really see the kind of hierarchies and the power relations between Dutch media and what is happening there. And also what I find very striking is in a detail, when you're talking about the aesthetics, let's say how the senses are controlled or how we can view, I think Miguel did a great job in also in that sense, how he created a kind of counter aesthetics by his editing, also in these kind of details where you see this woman, I guess it's the partner of the interviewer, just peeping into the frame when these union leaders are there. So you're wondering, why is this white woman standing there? But then later on, when this interviewer, this journalist is there standing on the embankment, then the woman also steps into the frame. And so you think, they are more like, so they become more like an emblematic image of figures, like they are passers-by, they are more like tourists, and they are coming to the island. Oh, something is happening there, but have no idea that that was already happening for 10, 15 years, this oppression of the workers. So suddenly there are riots. So, and I think that image really shows this, and I think it's also Miguel's achievement to recognize that in all that material that he could not search for, because there are no such terms that says, well, white woman walks into the frame. So, and I think this is also the kind of aesthetic, or maybe a counter aesthetic to these mainstream media that we have grown up with. And as I, being raised in the Netherlands as well, I had no idea until this film, I would say about the 30th of May, about these protests. And I think this is really, if we're talking about the geographies of freedom, and the freedom is also the freedom in the mind of the people in order to be able to resist. And I think that is really an important part of the freedom. And the capacity to resist that happened already with the example of class, and what Miguel explained as the starting point. So being able to think of freedom, I think this is the key to think of geographies of freedom.
Thank you so much. I think that's really rich. I also just want to point, like, as a sharing of references to the work of Quincy Garrio, who is a poet also from Curaçao and initiated, or was the first one to, I think, bring up the phrase like Zwarte Piet is racism. And he last year, in an ongoing project with his mother, presented a work where she, here in Amsterdam at the Appel, where she kind of build a model of this route that the workers took to in their protest and in their strike through Curaçao. It's called Kaleidoscopic Visions of Liberation. I'll share the link with you later, but yeah, just wanted to bring it to the attention. Because yeah, it's quite shocking how how it's so not part of public discourse, this kind of knowledge or awareness. I'm shocked myself, but yeah, maybe I'm looking at the time. I think all of you we can go a little bit over. Maybe we can segue into the discussion about decolonizing the university or academia, and the impossibility of it, perhaps, to do this within academia. And I think one anecdote that is important to bring up, which maybe some of you are aware of, is that there has been this durational performance at the VDKA, so the Art Academy in Rotterdam, by an artist hanging up a protest banner demanding free Palestine, and in protest against the continual violence that is right now going on. And it has been removed with the help of police force, and now been substituted by a banner with this is not a watermelon, which is an artwork kind of indicating the Palestinian flag. But anyways, this kind of fear, I was quite jawed by this, the fear and reaction of an institution of having to take down a banner that literally says free Palestine. I was wondering, maybe this has to do with this inherent tension and antagonism of what freedom means, that you touch upon within your research. But yeah, maybe, sorry.
Let me react to that, because I feel the responsibility as I teach on that academy to say something about it publicly, although this is a private screening anyway.
It's recorded.
Recorded even. So it can cost my job, but what the hell. Anyway, there's a couple of misunderstandings. It was not police that took the banner off, but it was security personnel from the academy itself, which is of course colored. And that's where the whole power dynamics also gets shifted. But anyway, we can talk about that later. And indeed, the banner was taken off because the director and the management team of the Willem de Kooning Academy, quote unquote, wanted to make the academy a safe place to all. That's the argument. And so no geopolitical statements are allowed on the building. I strongly oppose this. Because I am asked to trigger my students to think, and to be politically and socially and engaged. And I do that in every single lesson I give. And I totally don't agree with this absurd attitude, totalitarian, by the way. It's also an enormous lack of, it's not a lack of, yeah, lack of knowledge, because although I have all the sympathy for what happened, that the Jewish community didn't feel safe in Europe, I totally understand that. After the Second World War, I can understand, and the persecution that took place all over Europe. Let's be conscious about that, and also, therefore, also in the Netherlands. So I can understand that as a Jewish community, you don't feel very safe in the European environment. But let's not forget that that the rulers of what is now called Israel and Palestine was England. And it was because England was the colonial ruler of that area that it was possible to create the Israeli state. And to disconnect it from the colonial project is not that smart, to say the least. So the two issues are linked, but it doesn't matter. Besides that, there's I find it really an attack on if we're talking all the time about freedom of speech in this country, and you can say the most obnoxious things about Moroccans, you can say the most obnoxious things about any group, but when it comes to protesting for Palestine, then you're making people feel unsafe. I can't make a logic out of this, and I won't try it either. So that's what I have to say. I'm glad that students stood up. I'm glad that there was protests. I'm glad that that a lot of people rose their voices. I'm just saddened that the director and the management team didn't hear it that well. That's the only thing.
Yeah, Mikayla, as a student, like how do you experience like anti-colonial work or studies? What would is it even possible, or how would it look like in your like experience?
Yeah, I guess two different things. One, taking Yolanda's course, I think I've learned a lot in how it's possible. One, to study decolonial theory always as practice as well, and so always to take action, always to see how the lessons we learn inside of the university, like what is the impact of that outside of these spaces. But then also I would always say, like, look at who's being regarded as the knowledge producers. So partially it's like who's being studied, but it's also who's being valorized as knowledge producers. So I would say it's important, especially in the Dutch context, to look at the intellectuals, to look at the artists, to look at the movements that are happening in Curacao, that have happened in Curacao, but also in the other ABC SSS islands. So for example, that's also why I think this film was great, because it was clearly also, of course, Miguel's brilliant filming, and also like a collaboration with Charali, Pito Polo, I recognized as well, who are also incredible creators from Curacao, and some others, just to name a few, like Richanel Ansano, Rosemary Allen, like I mentioned, to look at Alice Juliana, to look at these names should be common, right? They should be known across the whole Dutch Empire. They should be in all of the syllabuses. And whereas before maybe something of language was stopping the inclusion of them, I think now everything's getting more translated and more accessible. So as far as decolonizing within the university, I think it's important to remember it will never only happen in the university. All these movements, such as 30 de May, it was not university students that started it. These were workers, right? Black workers primarily. And so, it always has to be action, look at the knowledge producers, and it's not only in the university where this will happen.
Can I just say one thing about what you previously said, Mikayla? You mentioned the De Que Manera song in the beginning and in the end again. And you mentioned very well it was songs sang after the abolition of slavery, so-called. And what I found beautiful about that music, and at the same time incredibly sad, is that the question that that song places is actually essential to understand the film, in the sense that the music places the question of, if I'm playing by the rules of the master, how can I ever be free? How can I ever find my freedom? And I find that incredibly rich. It's an incredibly rich song and a very important message. So thank you for mentioning that.
Could one of you share it maybe in the chat? That would be great. Sorry, you're muted.
I can try to find it.
Thank you. Maybe Yolanda, as like teaching decolonial practices, like what is your experience? Because I think what I'm speaking about more is this like discrepancy or like the critique of like Yves Tuck and Wayne Young of a subsumption of like all kind of demands for social and political justice under like a then phrase of decolonizing the school that becomes more like used more casually or something. And the actual like understanding the actual like project of reparation of indigenous land and life, which I think we don't even have to theorize. It appears in the surprise that has been present here tonight in like about like Cinco de Mayo or about like what is happening in Curacao, although it is like the most close and like maybe knowing, you know, being more engaged with Black Lives Matter or like other localities than these histories. I think that is like already kind of performing this discrepancy. So yeah, maybe Yolanda. And then afterwards, if anyone from the audience wants to ask a question, please write it in the chat or like raise your hand or something.
Yeah, I don't know if I, it's a difficult question. On the one hand, I think lots of things are happening at the universities at the moment that bring some, yeah, that bring more, how do you say it? Reflection to how colonial much of what we have been teaching, but also how not just the contents, but also the approach and who you see as knowledge producers, as Mika has said. So things are changing, but it's going very slow. And there's also a lot of people who don't want to participate so much. I do think if you look at the long, like, for example, University of Color, I think like it has been influential in the sense that lots of people are working on these issues now. I work at the philosophy department, and there's really a consensus that decolonization is important, that diversity policies are by far not enough, and also like that it has to be a profound kind of rethinking of the whole curriculum. But still, you refer to Tuck and Wang. I remember, maybe Mikayla, you also remember this discussion we had in the group when we read Bambra and also some others, like how huge the economic and political dimensions are of what would be just in the sense of like really repairing imperialism. That's enormous. But then still there were others in the class, the students also of like colonial or with experiences of being colonized, among them Omar Barghouti, and he stressed very much how important also decolonizing the mind is, and that there's a long tradition also of thinking about, like also with culture, literature. Bourbinas also shows how important that is, like language, all these non-material dimensions that are also very important. Also, like I think it was you, Miguel, who said that, like, but how do you say it? Maybe no, it was you, Mika, about freedom, like freedom to imagine it and to claim it, and I think that's also important. And last time we had a discussion on, wouldn't it be better to abolish the universities because they are so into the, but I think most of the students would like be also like what are the other options? Yeah, so some ambivalence.
Are there any questions from the audience? From the gray squares? I guess not. Well, maybe on this note of ambivalence, but I mean, kind of, I think you're going in the right direction. It's similar to discussing what abolishing the police means or could mean. Of course, it's difficult to imagine from within like a system, but I think, yeah, there's a lot to like think about and act on. Thank you so much, everyone, for this. It was really, incredible experience to be able to watch your film, but also to have this conversation. And I hope that we can somehow continue that also with Soapbox. Does anyone want to have the last word? Otherwise, I think we'll say goodbye. It's always very anticlimactic on Zoom, but yeah, I just
wanted to thank everyone at the Soapbox, but also at the university. Thank you so much for.
Okay, well, then I wish everyone a good night. We will upload this conversation, and also if you want to have any information from the chat, we will also save the links. Okay, bye.